Here's a quick note before we begin this episode of Eagle Freedom Presents. This episode features a powerful conversation about overcoming adversity. Because we want to have an honest discussion about mental health, we do touch on topics of depression, PTSD, and suicide. Please listen with care. And if you have little ones around, you may want to save this episode for a later time. Now, let's get underway with this episode of Eagle Freedom Presents.
This is Eagle Freedom Presents. Showtime.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Here's your host, Destin Rogers.
And welcome back to Eagle Freedom Presents. I am Destin Rogers. So, does where you come from dictate where you're going? Or is it actually possible to completely rewrite your destiny through sheer grit and principles? Today's guest answers that question with his entire life story. From living off the grid in rural Missouri to managing logistics inside the ultra-secure Cheyenne Mountain Complex, he embodies the very definition of our mantra, rise, inspire, and overcome. Dennis G. Smith is a retired U.S. Air Force major with over 50 years of leadership experience. His journey is nothing short of incredible. At just 16 years old, he dropped out of school to support his family. He eventually joined the military, climbed the ranks from enlisted service to commissioned officer, earned 2 college degrees, and raised a family. He served for 25 years, culminating in a top-secret role at headquarters NORAD and U.S. Space Command. Now, he is the author of Rising Up from Woodsmoke to Wings, a guide that uses his lived experience to teach resilience, empathy, and ethical leadership. We're also incredibly honored because this is Dennis's first ever interview. After a 50-year career, he chose to break the ice right here with the Rio movement. He's here to talk about finding your foothold, the power of storytelling, and how to turn adversity into your greatest asset. Would you please welcome Dennis Smith? Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Destin. That was quite an introduction. I'm very honored to be here with you this morning to chat with you. I'll try to share a little bit of insight into my background and how I got started as a young guy. Because, back when I was, just a young man, 12, 14 years old, it was a pretty tough living because we lived way off the grid. We didn't have much to go on. But I had an aspiration of becoming something more than just another hillbilly in the Ozarks. I wanted to see the world. And my dad, he was a great man, but he had a stroke, and he became, I guess, kind of like he had Alzheimer's type conduct and all that, and it became very difficult to live with him. He got very mean and everything, but he was still a good man. He just was dealing with mental issues. So at age 16, like you said, I did drop out of school just to basically survive. And I worked odd jobs and just tried to figure out what the next step was going to be. But at 17 and a half, I joined the Air Force. I had to get my dad, of all people, to sign me in because I was too young to join without it. And reluctantly, he did. But it was probably the best move I've ever made. But ever since I was a little kid, I kept seeing the Air Force logo signs when we drove to the church or whatever. It says, aim high, go Air Force. And it always stuck in my mind. So I knew what I wanted to do at a young age, but I didn't know how to get there because the environment I grew up in was very rugged. It was not conducive to professional development, if you will. It was just a tough place. But after I joined the military, it was a different thing. And then over the years, I developed the skills to communicate with people because I had dealt with a lot of issues, and I just got good at managing people. And the leaders in the military recognized that. And I went to school at night, on the weekends, whenever I could find time, and completed those 2 college degrees. And at 10 years in service, I was a E6 select. It's a tech sergeant select in the Air Force, but as I was going through officers training school, my line number for promotion came out. So I thought, well, if I flunk out of officer's training school, at least I'll have a rank to go back to. But anyway, I completed officer's training school and commissioned as a second lieutenant, and then proceeded for another 15 years to retire, like you said, out of NORAD U.S. Space Command there in Colorado Springs. But over the years, I developed, certain traits and attributes that I felt were significant in my career, because, it's hard for anybody nowadays, seems like, to really get a good foothold in life. And over the last several years, I've seen such a decline in enthusiasm among youngsters. They just, they're stuck to their telephones or iPads or something. And I feel like, they needed a foothold in life and how to climb out and become more than what they see just around them. So that was what was inspired me to write out the book. It's not a very long book, but it has a lot of important information there. And it's basically the roadmap that I followed throughout my career.
I want to kind of go back a little bit to as you were coming up, growing up back in Missouri. And as you mentioned, it was a tough time when you were growing up. If you hadn't made that pivot, that whatever that switch was that made you say, I'm going to join the military and change your directory, the direction you were going. If you think back to that time, what do you think you would have been doing had you not made that switch to join the military? Any thought about, you ever sit back and go, well, if I hadn't joined the military, what would I have been doing?
Yeah, my brother and I talk. My younger brother lives in Amarillo, and he and I talk about that all the time. Like, well, what happened? What would have happened had we not chosen the routes that we went? We would have probably ended up kind of like the other people in that area. It stagnated. There's not much employment. It was pretty hard to make a living down in that part of the country, even now. But you got to remember, back when I was growing up, when I came along in 1953, the United States has only been out of World War II for about 8 years, and my mom and dad, they came up through the time when Pearl Harbor was bombed, World War II hit, and then the Great Depression. And so there was a lot of setbacks in their lives that just kind of got them in a rut that they couldn't get out of, and that's how they ended up, resettling back in Missouri with very little to function with. They actually lived in California, Oregon, Washington, back in the early years of the 1900s. My dad, it was a lumberjack. He followed the big trees out there in California and Oregon. They did it by hand, crosscut saw and chopping axe. They didn't have chainsaws back then, but they kind of had to do migratory type work in order just to make a living, because there was nine of us kids. I'm third from the bottom, and so it was quite challenging. But had I stayed there, I don't know exactly what I'd done, but I'm an artist. I'm a craftsman. I worked at Silver Dollar City as a wood carver. I've always been creative. So I would have found some way probably to get into the arts or stick with the tourist industry there, working in Branson or someplace, because I did train with one of the probably the most professional wood carvers in the country. His name was Uncle John Finley back in the 60s. And his artwork and all his handmade tools were in a museum in Oklahoma, someplace that he used throughout his life. But that was something I was really interested in younger. But after I got out in the world, I was having so much fun in the Air Force that I just, I love traveling. I ended up living 10 years overseas in Europe and the Middle East. And before European Vacation movie came out, I did my own European vacation, if you will. I traveled from, let's see, where did I leave from? About 30 miles from the Syrian border in a Ford Escort with a Sears luggage rack on top, with a wife and 2 kids. And we drove all the way across Turkey. And let me tell you, that's quite an experience right there, because Istanbul is a long ways away from where I was at. And it's not like traveling here in the United States. So once we got across across the country and ended up traveling almost 6,000 miles, it was a test of a marriage, because if you survive a trip that far in a foreign country with a wife and 2 screaming kids, it's a miracle that you can survive. I'll be honest with you, but we did. But it was a lot of fun. I love the European people. I love the Turkish people. I spent 2 tours in Turkey, and they sent me to Turkish language school back many years ago. I forgot most of it, but during my first assignment, and some of the things I wrote about in the book. I wore uniform most of the time, but I also wore civilian clothes part of the time too, because I worked as a liaison officer out at the international airport, working behind the scenes with the Turkish immigrations and customs people to help Department of Defense families and members get in and out of country without getting hassled. Because living in Turkey is a very unique experience, and you don't just travel there leisurely. You got to know what you're doing, because you can sure end up in a lot of trouble if you do anything wrong. And I think I even wrote about one of the stories of having to smuggle a kid out of the country. But that's kind of what that all played out to be. But I had a great career.
When I was reading your book, you emphasized that true leadership, and we'll jump into that now. It's not defined by what rank you are, but it's defined by heart. Coming from a strict military hierarchy, how did you practice leading with heart when you had to make and give some very difficult orders?
Well, you can still give difficult orders and do it with heart. It was, you know, my thing when I was running an organization with several people was maintaining the discipline, maintaining the standards, because there were certain standards they had to adhere to. And I would not let the organization drop below the standard that was expected. So you just use compassion when you're dealing with troublesome troops. You become more like a father figure to some of these younger people, because you got to remember that a lot of the military, young enlisted, they didn't have real good family lives either. A lot of them didn't have moms, dads, whatever. So you became kind of like a father figure to them, and so you just had to kind of just play it by ear every day when you went to work as to how you handle things. And I had 2 guys break into my office one Friday night because they had gotten in trouble doing something, and I prepared a case of documentation on them. And they decided to break into my office one Friday night about 11 o'clock at night, and to see what all I had on them. And then Monday morning, I come in, I sat down at my desk, and I called my first troop in to chat with him, and he had a canned statement. He walked in and reported this, and he had a canned statement. And I thought, well, that's odd. He had too much time to think about it. And then I called the second guy in, and he said the same thing as the first guy. I was like, well, okay, these guys know too much. So then I call in the superintendent. He has a whole bunch of stripes on his sleeve. I said, I'll just call him Sergeant M. Sergeant M, I said, this is odd, because these 2 gentlemen, they know they did wrong. But the thing is, they both had canned statements. Well, he said, well, I was a lieutenant at the time. He said, well, he leaned back. He's kind of smart aleck. He leaned back and says, well, Lieutenant, I was afraid you'd go off the deep end if I told you. They broke into your office Friday night. I said, oh, they did they? He said, yeah. I said, well, Sergeant M, I said, it's 9 o'clock Monday morning. Why am I just now finding out about this? He said, well, I was afraid you'd go off a deep end. He said, I just figured I'd tell you this morning. I said, well, that's good to know. I said, but now you're in trouble. I said, you covered up a crime. I said, you're the superintendent of this place. I said, how am I supposed to handle that? Because the troops that I'm dealing with see you as a leader. He said, well, I guess that does look kind of bad. I said, well, Sergeant M, I said, I hate to do this, but you're fired. He said, you can't fire me. I said, yeah, I can. I said, clean out your desk. Sergeant M, there was another sergeant. He said, come here, you're taking over his job. So I relieved the senior NCO from his job, for 6 months. He got to do some other interesting things around the squadron. But I didn't ruin his career. But I taught him a lesson that you don't cover up a crime. And that maintained the discipline, because that whole unit had failed at inspection. And if we hadn't straightened things out, I would have been fired along with the base commander, wing commander, and everybody else that had previously been fired. So you still have to do things with compassion and heart, but you have to maintain those standards, and that's
Yeah.
all I did.
Yeah, and also in your book, you talk a lot. You say that observation before judgment
Oh
has
yeah,
always guided your
yeah.
management,
Yes
and
sir,
and it may have saved a life
yes
because of
sir.
something you said. Do you want to tell us about what that was?
Yeah, certainly. I back younger when I was younger, I was kind of a quiet person because I get more out of observing what's going on in an organization or in a meeting or anything like that, because a lot of people are have such a tendency to rush in like they're the experts on everything and not really know the full story. So I sat back and listened for a little while. I watched, and this one troop that I had working for me, he was a good kid, but my office overlooked the entire staff sitting out there. We issued airline tickets and shipped household goods and stuff like that. So we had a lot of customers coming and going through the front door. And his demeanor changed. I noticed he wasn't filing his paperwork. He started coming to work looking sloppy. I said, something just ain't right. And I just kept watching him over the course of a few days. And I called him in and I said, I, I just sat him down without even closing the door. I said, what's going on with you? I said, you've changed. He said, I told him, I said, you've been one of the best troops I've ever had. He kind of just sighed. He said, well, sir, if I tell you, you'll probably kick me out of the service. I said, why would you think that? I said, did you kill somebody? And he laughed. He said, no, I didn't kill anybody. I said, well, how bad can it be? So I reached over and shut the door. And I said, okay, talk to me. Tell me what's going on. I can't help you if I don't understand what the problem is. And this was back when the military had don't ask, don't tell policy for gays being in the military. And I said, just talk to me. Tell me what's eating at you. He said, well, sir, if I tell you, you'll kick me out. I said, well, just trust me. I said, spill the beans. All right, talk to me. He said, sir, I'm gay. I said, are you thinking about killing yourself? And he just froze and leaned back in his seat and just tears welled up in his eyes. And he said, sir, how did you know to ask that? I said, because I said, I can read you like a book. I said, I've been through pain and hurt, to the point, I felt like giving up. I said, I recognize that same pain and hurt in your expressions and the way that you're doing things. You changed the way you appear. You used to be a very professionally dressed, polished, smitten, polished, everything. I said, you changed. I said, can we get you back to that level? They said, well, you're not going to kick me out? I said, no, sir, I'm not going to kick you out. I said, you're one of my best troops. Why would I want to kick you out? I said, you just keep your private life private. Don't come I didn't put this in the book, but I said, but don't come to work in women's clothes or come through the front gate with makeup on, because they will check your ID card. I said, it's out of my hands if they do that. And so he laughed. He said, "Oh, sir, I wouldn't do that." I said, "Well, I didn't think you would, but that's how that all came about."
Is that something you developed early in life as far as your compassion? Because as you've talked here, just in the
Yeah,
few minutes we've had the opportunity to, I can see that you're a very compassionate person.
yeah,
You like to understand people. You like to help people.
yeah.
Were you guided in that in your early years?
Oh, yeah, I was, because back when I first joined the military, everybody got to remember Vietnam was going hot and heavy when I joined, and I had orders for Vietnam, and everybody in my basic training class, we all got selected for basically security police, which is base defense. We're carrying an M16 and a pistol on our side. So my first job for the first couple of years was that of a military police security. We maintained the security on the base and around the B-52s that had conventional and nuclear warheads on them. We did all kinds of stuff, but also out during that time, it was just a lot of stress. And during my tenure in those positions, we had a couple of guys kill themselves. And I like, how bad can it be? I said, we're getting paid. I mean, yeah, it's not ideal, but this is temporary. And then, I hear a gunshot off in the distance, and I already know what it is. But I just started. I learned how to read people because of the trouble and pain that I felt as a kid. I pick up on senses from other people when they're dealing with stuff. So I wished back then that I'd have had more contact with somebody like that, because I could probably prevented it. Matter of fact, I actually prevented a suicide on my post. Uh,
Mm.
I was up in front of a B-52. It was sitting on alert. It had nuclear weapons on board. And there was a guard shack out behind the aircraft, a couple hundred feet. And I see the perimeter guard back there. And he walks over to the gate shack. And you can step in these gate shacks and warm up because there's a heater there and there's a stool. He sat down on that gate shack, but then I saw that barrel come up to his chin of his M16. And and I'm thinking he's going to kill himself. And I've got a radio attached to my collar, so I go run around that aircraft as fast as I can go. And just as I open the door, he pulled the trigger on that gun. And an M16 never misfires; it misfired.
Mm.
I grabbed him, handcuffed him, put him on the ground. He thought he was dead. He didn't know it, but he handcuffed him, laid him there. I picked up his gun, pulled back the bolt, out popped the round, dent in the primer. It just didn't go off. And, ever since then, I've just been very aware of what's going on with military people because that's all I've been around for my whole life. Because you don't know the stresses that they're under. So I watch and observe nonverbal communication, if you will. People tell me a lot just by how they appear to me. So.
I guess this is a good point to jump into this. You had mentioned to me, since you were talking about suicide, that you'd mentioned to me that PTSD. It isn't just military. It exists at all levels, all ages, and you believe that many tragedies, including suicide, happen because people lack a mental roadmap. Now, for the person who's listening right now, who maybe feels lost in that negativity and depression, what does that mental roadmap look like? They may have no idea what it is you're talking about.
Yeah, well, that mental roadblock is really they don't see a way out of that valley that they're facing. The images of what they've dealt with or what they perceive as tragic in their own minds. A lot of it, it's just perceived. It's really not as bad as they probably think it is, but yet that's all they dwell on. So when they start dwelling on all the negative things that they're facing, it gets worse. So if people could change their mindset and start focusing on the good things at that point in their life, like, okay, this stuff happened, but it'll pass. What are the good things that have happened? And start focusing on those. And that's what I've tried to emphasize with the troops when I help roll call or open range inspection. I would talk to them about dealing with the stresses of the military, and every now and then I'd have a staff meeting. I just get everybody in a conference room and said, "Okay, everybody, let's just have an open conversation. Y'all tell me stories. Tell me some story about what all you're dealing with, or something funny, or something bad has happened." And get them to open up and start talking. And once they started talking, telling their story, like, oh, people are listening to me. And some of it was funny, some of it was sad, but I think that was a avenue for them to release the things that they were focusing on, that could have very well taken them down the wrong trail. Because I dealt with several suicides in the military. It happens, but every one that actually happened, I didn't have direct contact with them. And I asked their supervisor, I said, weren't there any signs that you could have triggered on as to maybe prevent it? Well, come to think about it, yeah, he did this or did that. And I said, well, why didn't you say something? So it's just the fact that empathy has to be exercised in the day-to-day functions in order to be able to manage. Because if you can't manage with empathy and understanding and realizing that people are dealing with things that you can't see, so it's what's on your collar doesn't matter. It's what's in your heart and how you see them is what matters. Because you have to learn how to handle people like that and teach them how to deal with it.
You talk a lot about empathy in your book and leadership. And, we live in a society now where everything it's just fast paced,
Mm-hmm.
So for the leaders that are out there, because this is a good time to talk about those that are in the leadership role
Mhm.
and how they can be, there's empathetic and there's sympathetic, and how they, can differentiate between the two. But how can they, excuse me, but how can they, be more empathetic? What can they do to become more empathetic so they can truly understand what it is their subordinates are going through and how they can help them?
Well, I think they need to understand, or a lot of people need to understand that empathy and empathy are two different things. Because empathy, you can see the pain dealing with that people are dealing with. Empathy, they're focused on their own self. They're not looking. They're more focused on just what's going on around them. So if you don't demonstrate, the ability to communicate, because empathy just basically is nothing more than just showing people that you care. But if you're so focused on, meeting a time frame for a report or a time frame for getting something done, I'm guilty of it. I mean, you get so tied up with a tight schedule that you'll be looking at your clock when somebody's trying to explain to you a problem, and that's a signal that you're not paying attention. So it's just something you kind of have to work on. But I would really, you know, you know, if you look at all the different things I spoke about in that book, it's pretty much everything that I exercise daily throughout my career to manage people.
Do you think that what happens with in a leadership role is that leaders tend to think that that's not their role. Maybe that's not their job. My job is just strictly to make sure everything runs fine. I don't have time to get involved in personal problems and stuff like that. Do you think sometimes there is that pressure? Just get the job done?
Yeah, oh yeah, oh definitely so. When I think one of those stories I told in the book was at a meeting that I was called into to sit there, and it was chaired by a four-star general, and it was a top secret type related meeting. So it was a lot of senior officers in there. And at that time, I was just a captain, and I sat there for 45 minutes, hour, or whatever it was, and just listened to all this debate going around in a circle, and it was absolutely going nowhere. And finally, I guess after about 45 minutes, the general looked over at me, and he said, "What do you say, Captain Smith? You've been quiet. What's your thoughts?" Well, at that point, I'd already formulated my opinion that there was so much ego in that room. Everybody wanted to be right with their presentation as to what they were doing, but they hadn't really dug deep enough into it. But it's just, I think ego has a lot to do with, excuse me, uh, with not being able to manage correctly, because just because you've got a title or a higher rank on your collar, or sometimes people have a tendency to talk down to others, or just they're trying to make a name for themselves in front of the boss as to how bright and smart they are, and it can go the other direction. So
And it's interesting that as we talk about this, and I think if I remember correctly, you talk about it too in the book, is about being more of a listener than
mhm.
always being the one, to do the talking, because you can gain so much out of just listening to what's going
listen
on.
listen to what's going on, and then chime in once you formulate a good opinion, because what a lot of folks didn't realize at that time, well, about 3 months, 4 months prior to that meeting, General Horner, he was the commander in chief of NORAD U.S. Space Command. He needed a top secret report prepared that was to go to the Pentagon and be briefed there. And I didn't know this, but I guess they floated all around the headquarters there. They were looking for an officer, a captain, in a position that would be willing to take on preparing that top secret report. And nobody would accept it. They said, "Well, I don't know why, but they wouldn't." And then my boss came to me one morning and said, "General Gill wanted me to ask you if you'd be willing to take on this, preparing this top secret report." And then he tells me that everybody else has refused it. I chuckled. I said, "Well, why did they refuse it? He said, well, he said, if it's not done right and you can't brief it at the Pentagon at the Joint Chiefs level, it will end your career. I said, well, that's interesting. I think I ought to take it then. And he said, you want it? I said, yeah. I said, there's no competition for one. And I like tough challenges. So yeah, I'll take it. So 3 or 4 months into that, I was getting the project done, doing what they didn't think could get done as far as coordinating and getting it together. So General Horner already kind of knew that I had taken that on a little bit. I guess that's why he looked over at me. But I had some insight to things that they didn't have. But had anybody else in that building had taken it on, they could have done it too. But they were only looking at themselves. They weren't thinking about the mission. They were just like, well, I don't want to lose my career. I don't want bad negative on my report. But if we go to war, you gotta be prepared to go to war. And I didn't look at it as I'm doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the command. I'm doing this for my country.
Yeah, I was going to say you obviously are somebody who's not afraid to take on a challenge, right?
Right. I'm never afraid of that.
Yeah, because you worked, and let's be honest, you worked in probably one of the most highest pressure environments on Earth, working in NORAD. So since we're on that, what's a technique that you use to help you make those clear decisions that had to be at that level? What is there a technique that you used?
Well, I don't know if it's really a technique, but it's just I've got a friendly personality. And so when it came time to put the report together, I just went to the different, because this is a joint command, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and even Canadian forces. So I had a lot of coordination to do. And some of them were reluctant to release the information to go into this report, particularly the Canadian forces. They didn't want to release it. But I just kept after them. And finally, when they didn't meet my deadline, I just went up to the colonel's or general's office and told her secretary, I said, I haven't received your information yet from your staff. I said, here's the problem. I've got to brief this to General Horner. And General Horner isn't going to be real pleased with y'all if you can't provide the information. I hate to give him a negative report that I can't get it from y'all. I had it the next day. Okay, so it was just how I communicated with these folks. It's pretty much what pulled it together. But yeah, it's high stress, high pressure, and then of course I've got all my bosses and everything looking to me to make sure I was getting all the I's dotted and the T's crossed in putting this report together. And the colonel I worked for, he said, well, after I got it done, he said the General Grill, our immediate boss. He said he wants you to take this up and brief General Horner on it. I said, okay. So on a Thursday, I think it was about 2:00 in the afternoon, that was our scheduled time. And Colonel Martin and I went up there and we're waiting our turns to go in and see the 4-star. And as we're sitting there waiting, we're waiting for these other people have been in there briefing. They're coming out holding their butt because they got chewed out so bad. They were, really in pain when they came out of the general's office. And Colonel Martin looked at me and says, Captain, don't screw this up, whatever you do. So I said, I'll try not to. So I go in and report into the general. He's a big fella. He's leaning back in the chair. I laid that report in front of him. He just went, is this another one of those BS reports, Captain? I said, yes, sir, it is, but I still need your signature. That's the first straight answer I've had all blank day. He signed it, hands it back to me. I said, thank you, sir. Walked out the door. And that's all it was. Get out in the hallway, and Colonel Martin says, I can't believe that's all you told me. I said, look, he's been hearing BS all day long. He wanted a straight shoot. Yeah, it's a BS report, but that's what he wanted to hear. Just somebody tell him what it really is. And he said, well, now you got to go brief the Joint Chiefs. I said, okay. When do you want me to go? He said, well, they'll send the report up, and then but you're going to D.C. and report into the Joint Chiefs of Staff office. So I get all fancied up in my blue uniform, and I go to D.C. and I walk into the Pentagon, go down to the Joint Chiefs area, go in, and the colonel, kind of receptionist there, I told him who I was and why I was there, and General Horner had sent me. He said, let me get the report. So he goes out and gets it. He opens it up. He said, anything particular in here that you'd like to tell me about? I told him a little bit about it. he said, well, that's really good. He said, this is the first time we've had this report completed to this level of proficiency. I said, well, does the Joint Chiefs have any question? No. He said, I'll take care of it from here. You don't have to brief anymore. Thank you for coming to see us. I saluted and walked out the door. And that was all it was. But it was just, being who I am. I never tried to butter up to anybody. I didn't try to make airs. I'm just an old country boy from Missouri. I speak two languages, hillbilly and Southern. I mean, that's just who I am. And I guess they knew that. So
Well, it's interesting because there's, when you're having to deal with on that level with those types of reports, and
yeah.
everything's got to be right, and you're relying on others to get you the information. And you're right. There's two ways of doing it. You can go in and demand, look, I need this information now, or you can go the way you did it, which obviously proved to be the better route because you were able to get things accomplished. And it's a lot of how we react and act to certain situations. One of the things that you talk about in your book is resilience because, being in the military, you've got to have a lot of resilience,
Yeah.
right? And there's no doubt that resilience is extremely important. But you say that there's 5 strategies for developing resilience. Can you touch on some of those for our listeners?
Well, resilience, yeah, it's a mental frame of mind, really, because it's how you look at life in general. Because if you're faced with some of the crisis situations that I've dealt with in my life, you, you, with me, I put it in God's hands. And I said, Lord, I don't know how to handle this, but so, guide me for the next step. And that's how I kept bouncing back. But I just tried to keep my focus on the positive things instead of focusing on the negative things for resilience, and not let the bad things take hold. Because if you keep a positive look at it and evaluate it correctly, I think you can bounce back from just about any situation. Because there's absolutely nothing in this world uh, at all just keep you from advancing. As long as you maintain the right frame of mind and you've got a good work ethic and a good personality that gets along with people. So I would just say that resilience is just a inherent ability just to deal with the stresses of day-to-day life. It's I don't know if there's any one particular thing that you can pin it down to, but
You talk a lot about leadership, about empathy, and when reading your book, you talk a lot to the younger generation, which I think is important. I think it's important that as an older generation, we hand down the things that we've learned to the younger generation because there's so much distraction
all
today,
right,
to so many things distracting, and so really hard to concentrate. And the younger generation doesn't have a lot of what we had when we were growing up,
right.
sometimes not at home and stuff like that. But how can all of this, the leadership, the empathy, how can all of this, besides the military, how can all of that be translated into everyday life for somebody who's not involved in military, but everyday life is it's just hard on them?
Well, sure. And yeah, I spoke to a lot, speak to the younger folks in this because, when you're 14, 15 years old, you really don't have a roadmap in life. But if you read the book and you understand those different attributes and you think about them and how you can apply it, you don't learn them all at one time. I didn't learn these things at one time. It's just over the course of your experience and years of trying to apply it where you can. I think you can actually build yourself to a point that you can step out of the bad environment you're in, and or a bad situation, whatever the case may be, and advance in just about anything you set your mind to. But the first thing to do, they have to accept that they're not where they want to be, and they have to have a desire and a work ethic and the drive to jump out there and try something different. Because if you're stagnated in one spot, move to a different spot. Is basically what I'm trying to convey with these things, and these are all attributes basically that you learn over time. But you got to have a basic awareness of them so that, so that as you proceed through life, that you can apply it in your day-to-day communication and involvement. I would say to the young folks nowadays, there's really no roadmap in life to success. I mean, you can't really rely upon peers to guide you because they're lost as you are. And if you listen to some of the folks, they'll lead you down a wrong road, and you'll go from bad to worse. So you have to be careful who your friends are, and you got to follow the right leadership, so that that you'll end up succeeding. Uh, I didn't have that as a kid. I just like, I don't like it where I'm at. I don't like, not having food. I don't like, not having good clothes to wear. And two, I lived in a very hostile home for the last part of my youth there. And it was just, my dad threatened to kill me twice just because I didn't like what he was doing to my mom. So I'm sure there's a lot of young folks that probably face the same thing, that they don't know how to get out of it. But I would encourage people, don't give up, keep a positive attitude, work on your work, get a good work ethic, and maintain a good attitude about things. Just tell stories, find funny things in your life and tell others those funny things. Don't tell the bad thing, but once you start telling stories, I've been a storyteller my whole life, and I think that's how I dealt with
Yeah,
it. But
it's interesting is since you're talking about, work and, I think we live in a time now where people don't want to, they want the quick road, right? The
yeah,
quick road to success. And you talk about integrity
mhm.
and so let me ask you, why is integrity actually a faster route? Because you can talk about this to success than shortcuts, even when it feels like, the honest path is slower. Tell us about that. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, integrity, a lot of folks I'm not sure really understand integrity. Integrity is doing the right thing even when nobody's looking, and as long as you approach everything that if you're working for McDonald's and you're serving burgers and you're taking the money or whatever, your integrity is doing the right thing, putting the right amount in the cash register and serving the customer what they ask for. So that's integrity. But a lot of folks I don't really think understand how to apply that every day, because like they see so much bad things going on around them that, well, it must be working for them because they're getting all this publicity and they're misreading the whole scenario as to what's really taking place. They're being guided down the wrong trail, because life, you have two trails to follow in life: the good side and the bad side. So if you maintain a good integrity, a good solid work ethic, and respectful to the people that you're around, and show that you care and have the empathy towards others, I think you can just not accomplish anything.
You talk about, I kind of want to jump back to the gentleman who came into your office, who you observed was, you brought up the question, was he, contemplating taking his life? That was a point where you were being vulnerable as a leader,
Mhm.
because you wanted to show compassion towards this individual,
Right.
but it was also for the individual on the other side. It was vulnerable for him to open up
Open
to
up.
you. Yeah, tell us about vulnerability and being out there, because some people say, "Well, I can't talk about that. I don't want to, that makes me vulnerable." Tell us a little bit about that. Your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, it, yeah, it opens you up for criticism and all that. But the thing is, you're releasing the restraints that's holding you back. I mean, you can't just talk to anybody. You find someone that's trustworthy and that you feel like you can chat with, and then tell them what you're dealing with. I mean, because this, some things are hard to deal with on your own unless you share it with others. Now, I've got a younger brother. He and I share stories all the time, and I guess he's kind of my outlet sometimes, and I'm his. So, it's just vulnerability is just a part of life. I mean, because you face so many different things that that you feel like, well, I might, this might happen to me if I do that or whatever. you just kind of have to work through that and start putting a little trust in somebody that, that can guide you the right direction, because not everybody's out to hurt you. A good many people will certainly step up to the plate and say, yeah, here, let's talk about it this way, or let's do it this, maybe look at doing it this way, sort of thing.
Yeah. And you talk, so as a leader, when you show that you're vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
then it also allows those underneath you to go, okay, maybe it's not, if my leader is vulnerable to us, then
Oh
it's
yeah.
not a bad thing to become
Yeah, yeah.
vulnerable and just
It's
share information.
it's not bad. I think being vulnerable, if you share in the right setting, I think it's uh, actually gives you personal freedom in the way you think and act, because people don't know what you're going through, and it's some of the things that I've dealt with. I didn't want to share when I was younger, but I've shared them with a certain individual, not just anybody, but it helped me overcome all the restraints that I was basically placing on myself. So, releasing the vulnerability actually releases the restraints that you've placed on your own life.
I was gonna say you obviously deal with a lot of being where you are at, your rank in the military, you deal a lot of intelligence. There's an intelligence you talk about in the book, and it's called emotional intelligence. Explain what that is.
Well, emotional intelligence, I don't know if I can explain it or not, but when you when you look at situations with emotion, your emotion is either positive or hurtful, or some kind of emotion there that's driving you. So, and you kind of have to observe others in that same aspect. Like, okay, they're dealing with something. It's an emotional situation. You just kind of have to be aware of it. Emotional intelligence is just being aware, basically, of what others are dealing with. Because just like that young troop that was thinking about committing suicide, it was an emotional intelligence that caused me to bring him in the office and chat. But I didn't just blatantly just burst out and say, "Well, you're this, you're doing that," or all that. It was a very free environment that sat there and chat honestly and openly without fear of retaliation, because that's one thing you don't ever do. When somebody puts trust into you, you don't break that trust.
Yeah, and it's
And
so hard to get it back.
yeah, you can't get it back. Yeah, it just won't come back. And you'll destroy yourself as a leader. Because I've seen leaders that I wouldn't put in charge of running a chicken house. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I, it's just they weren't cut out to be leaders. I worked for a colonel at one time that under his command, he was so bad that we had two individuals in the unit actually commit suicide because of the stress that he put on them because of his own nitpicking uh, or narrow-minded thinking. It's kind of hard to describe. I mean, a very intelligent guy with a degree I think he had an aeronautical engineering degree, and he knew how to fly a C-5 probably better than anybody. Uh, but when it comes to managing people, I wouldn't let that guy manage a chicken house. I ain't kidding you, because I mean, he he would he would run all the chickens off, and that's kind of what happened within his section. I didn't work for him, but I knew of him right there because I saw it. I saw it what was happening, but because of his rank, there's nothing I could do about it. So, but I did talk with one of the colonels over there in his department. So I don't know how you get to put up with this, but
Yeah, you cover so much in the book, but there's a metaphor you use in the book, and it's about the acorn growing into an oak tree.
yeah. Well,
Tell us
that's my
about that.
humor that's coming back in me here. But yeah, you know, when you come into this world, there's, you know, people have a tendency just wherever they land is where they stay. And that's what I saw in my home area of the Ozarks. they think, well, this is where I was planted. This is where I'm going to have to grow regardless. But, that isn't necessarily the case. And anybody that's, that just, some people do very well stay in the spot that they landed in. But if it's not the spot that's getting you where you want to go, you're going to have to start thinking outside the box and try to reach the goals that you want by finding the avenues. I didn't have a penny to my name or anything. I had one little old paper bag with, I think, a pair of jeans in it and some underwear, and that's all I carried to basic training. I didn't have nothing else. So you take what you have, even if it's nothing, and set out to figure out a way to get your foothold so that you can get into something better. I mean, you may have to start out working a little jobs here or there at a time. I worked 3 or 4 different jobs, even on active duty back in the early years, because frankly, my first paycheck was $79. I mean, you don't go very far on $79 in 1971. So when I wasn't wearing a uniform, I was helping a carpenter. I was doing stuff like that to make a few extra bucks on the side. So you just have to, dig in and figure out a way.
So the book, again, Rising Up from Woodsmoke to Wings. How did the actual book come about? What made you decide to put this out?
Well, going back the mid 2000s, I think it was, I met a World War II veteran up in the VA in Asheville, North Carolina, and he was in his late 80s, early 90s then, I guess it was. And he and I became friends. And he was a lonely veteran. He lived by himself. His wife had passed away. His kids had all moved away. And he and I sat there at the VA one day, and we both had appointments. We sat there and chatted for, I don't know, a couple hours. We went to our appointments, came back, and sat there for another couple hours. He missed his ride back to his house, so I gave him a ride home. And we get to his house, and we sat there and drank coffee and talked for another couple of hours. So Lewis, he told the stories of what he endured during his D-Day invasion, what he endured during when he was liberating France and things like that. And he told it with such compassion. And he was telling me about all the different things. But then he says, my kids, they don't care what I did. Society doesn't care what I did. I saw my buddies get killed. He said, but nobody cares. And as he told me all that, I'm like, wow, this guy has given his life, soul, and everything to, our freedom. And I don't know, at some point along in there, he goes, I got something I want to give you. So he goes and back room comes out. He comes out with a manuscript. He had written detailed manuscript of his time in World War II. Some of it was written, he had written it on just scrap pieces of paper and stuck it away, and he compiled it. He knew how to type, so he typed out this 80, 90 page manuscript, and I spent time reading it. And then, I'd like to be able to leave something for others to learn from what I went through instead of just reading about it after I'm dead. So I wanted to create something that would be beneficial to others because, I knew I wasn't an exception. I knew that, my life started out rough, but so did others. And I wanted others to be able to maybe have a little bit easier route to follow. So that's why I decided to put the book together, because it's really not about me. It's just, I wanted to help others get kind of a foothold in life so that they could tell their story at some point in time. But I've got his manuscript over there in my drawer, and I don't know what I'll ever do with it. But I tell you, it's heartbreaking. It's probably never get published, but I wanted to put something in there that was, touch on some of the funny things and the stories that I did, because trust me, there's a lot of stuff I left out. But that would kind of, get their interest and keep them entertained as they go along, trying to understand how to apply these different attributes and things that I've written about.
You've gone through a lot in your early life, through the poverty, you've gone through trauma, you've gone through the leadership structure. If you were 18 today, knowing obviously what you know now, what would be your first step to build a solid foundation? Maybe somebody out there is 18 years old right now wanting to know what's their first step to building a solid foundation.
Well, one is get your education. First step nowadays. I don't know. This is it's a tough one nowadays because you got technology and stuff nowadays that we didn't have back then. So, first step for an 18-year-old right now would, in my opinion, would be to talk to others in the profession that perhaps that they'd like to get into. Uh, my grandson, he's 18, 18 years old, 19. And he called me here some time back. He says, Papa, he said, I'm studying to become a project engineer or whatever it was. He said, how can I get started doing that? So I sat down and I wrote him up an outline as to how he could get his foot in the door with being a project engineer. So you seek out people that already have experience in certain areas, and then ask their guidance. And for to me, if I was an 18-year-old, I'd be looking for a professional in that career field that's of interest to them. I don't know whether it's aviation or engineering or computer programming, but I would be going talking to people like that and asking them, sit down with them over a Coke or whatever, and ask questions about how did you get started doing this? What's the fun part? What's the bad part? And start learning about it, so that you can make an intelligent decision at 18 as to know which road to follow. Because I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. The only thing I had in my mind when I was a kid was that road sign along the road that said, "Aim high, go Air Force," and that's the only thing I had to go on. And so, that would be my recommendation. Is just try to team up, partner up with other people that have the same interest.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the book. So for somebody out there who's wants to get a copy of the book, how can they one reach out to you and how can they get a copy of the book?
Well, just go to Amazon.com or Books and Noble, type in the book title, and it'll pop right up. And but I also have a website that you can go to. My website is Smith Book, right, right, Woodsmoke.com. And you click on that and you can read my bio, and also just it will take you to the Amazon site, book site. So if you want a book, so it just kind of gives you the prelude as to what the book's about, and how to jump into it. But it's on Amazon. It's at Barnes and Noble. It's not a fancy book. It's I don't like long wordy books. I usually lose interest after about 100, 150 pages. So I tried to keep it where it was readable and kind of to the point. My One of my degrees is in curriculum development, so it may look like a lesson plan. I don't know, but anyway, I worked in stories throughout the book that would kind of drive those points home a little bit and be entertaining, because it's just my humble attempt at trying to help others have some kind of roadmap to follow that I didn't
Right.
have. So.
Well, we've touched on a lot. Is there anything you would like our listeners to know about you, your book, or maybe some parting advice or guidance?
Well, I appreciate people reading the book, and I've had a lot of really good feedback from folks that have read it, and it really touched my heart when I got a email from, or a text or something from a fellow that had read it, and he said that it helped him recognize that one of his uh, work members was looking like he was, having some serious problems, and he said he wished he had known about the book sooner, because he could have probably perhaps prevented him from committing suicide.
Mm.
Really touched me when he said that. But parting advice: just keep a good attitude. Use it as a roadmap, if you will. And, it just kind of creates your own story because, that how you start out in life really doesn't really drive things, but it's how you finish up is what you're shooting for because you can write your own future when you're young, but when you get to my age, all you got everything is in a rearview mirror. So I got more years behind me than I do ahead of me.
Gotcha.
Everybody's going to get to that point at some point, and
Right.
I just want to leave something behind that perhaps would be beneficial to somebody, and that's pretty
Right.
much all there is to it.
Dennis, we've covered a lot of stuff, so I have one final question before we end here. The podcast, it's called Eagle Freedom Presents. So my question to you've been in the military, so you kind of understand a little bit, but let me ask you, what does freedom look like or mean to you now?
Wow. Well, I've lived in countries where they don't have freedom. I said I wasn't going to get emotional, but that's an emotional one. Give me just a second. When I lived over in Europe and the Middle East, there's a lot of people don't have the freedoms that we do, and people in the country are taking this for granted that they could lose what they have if they're not careful. And some of the things that I've seen happen in the world, it's kind of indicating to me that that things don't get on track and people don't get their head straight. They're going to be missing out on freedoms that they wish that they'd held on to because those freedoms that we got now are paid for by military people. Usually, like my friend Lou, who he lost hundreds of friends, buddies in the World War II, on Omaha Beach, So I just say, don't let that be a waste. Go to waste. Keep fighting for freedom, whatever it takes.
All right. All right. Dennis's story is the perfect example of what we stand for at Eagle Freedom Presents. And if you're ready to rise, inspire, and overcome in your own life, please grab his book. Again, it's called Rising Up From Woodsmoke to Wings, and tag us on social media with the hashtag Rio Movement. And if you're ready to rise up, please type Rising Up in the comments below. And then let us know which chapter hit home for you, because we'd love to hear your story. So Dennis, I just want to thank you very much for sharing your journey with us today. Thank you for your service to our country. You're a very compassionate individual. I can see that. You're very passionate about your military service, about what you've done for this country, and understanding what freedom means to you. I could see how emotional that is to you. So again, we want to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your journey with us.
Well, thank you, Destin. I really enjoyed our chat. I've always enjoyed reaching out and talking to others. And if somebody wants to ask me something, if they go to that website that I told you about, it's Smith Book, woodsmoketowings.com. You can send me a message there, and I'll get it on my email. So that's probably be the easiest way, or just let you know, and you can pass my email or phone number off to them. Be glad to chat with them.
All right. Before we go, I want to add a quick note. Dennis and I, we discussed some very heavy topics today, including depression. We talked about PTSD, and we did touch, of course, on suicide. So if you or someone you know is struggling, please know that you are not alone and that there is support available. In the U.S., you can dial 988 anytime to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Reaching out is the first step to rising up. So take care of yourselves. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Eagle Freedom Presents.
Thank you, Destin.
To learn more about our mission and become a part of hashtag Rio Movement, visit eaglefreedompresents.com. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs a beacon of hope. If you know someone who has an amazing story of overcoming, send us an email to eaglefreedompresents@gmail.com. And remember our mantra, rise, inspire, overcome. Podcast distribution for Eagle Freedom Presents provided by Podetize. Visit podetize.com for all your podcast needs.